Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from RAU'S IAS Study Circle.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the Hindu newspaper from UPSC perspective.
Today we will discuss the daily edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 31st March 2022, and the articles that we will discuss today are displayed on your screen. So let us start the discussion. Now, in our series of weekly answer writing practice from the Daily News Simplified videos, the question for this week is analyzing the issues faced by cotton textile industry in India, highlight measures taken by the government to promote cotton industry in India. You have to write the answer in 150 words and submit it before Saturday to get it checked by the evaluation team. There is an announcement that the Prelims Compass magazines for the history and the culture of India has been released, and other important magazines from the prelims examination perspective like the Economic Survey, Indian Economy and Environment will be released soon. The link to get the access to these magazines will be provided in the description box below. This editorial on page number 8 is related to the geopolitics of West Asia. In West Asia, we are aware that Israel and Arab countries were confronting each other for a very long period of time on the Palestinian cause. However, with normalization of ties between these confronting Arab countries and Israel because of the finalization of Abraham Accords, there are new kinds of events that are shaping up in the West Asia, and that is changing the geopolitics of West Asia. That is why the editorial has been termed as shifting sands, because earlier the Israel and the Arab countries were confronting each other on the Palestinian cause because Palestinians are Arabic and the Arab countries mostly supported the Palestinian cause against Israel, and the Arab countries and the Israel have fought war in the past on the issue of Palestine. However, now with the finalization of Abraham Accords, the relations between these Arab countries and Israel are now normalizing, and that is why first event that took place in case of normalization of ties between Israel and Arab countries like UAE and Bahrain was the finalization of Abraham Accords, which is seen as normalization of ties between Arab countries and Israel. In this context, another important event that took place after the finalization of Abraham Accords was the formation of Middle Eastern Quad, or the Middle Eastern Quad group. In this, the members are Israel, United States of America, UAE and India. And in continuation with this is the latest conference that has taken place in Israel's Negev desert. And this conference involved US, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Egypt and Israel. So this Negev Desert Conference is being seen as changing the geopolitics of West Asia, because this is also a one step further in case of normalization of Arab-Israel ties. Now, this is mainly shaping up because both the Arab countries and Israel see Iran as a rising threat. And that is why in this conference, these countries discuss the security partnerships as well as the issue of Iran. Now, Iran, as you might all be aware, is a Shia-dominated country, while the Arab countries are Sunni-dominated countries. And that is why this is one of the fault lines that exists in West Asian geopolitics. So the first event that took place was finalization of Abraham Accords. Second was the formation of Middle Eastern Quad. And now in continuation with this normalization of Arab-Israel ties is the latest Negev Desert Conference that has taken place. Now, due to the finalization of Arab-Israel ties, there are various challenges that are being faced by West Asian countries. The first event that is taking place in the case of geopolitics of West Asia is that US is slowly and steadily withdrawing from the region. Now, this could clearly be seen when the Houthi rebels attacked some of the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. US did not do much to save Saudi Arabia from such attacks. This clearly shows that US is now not getting involved in the conflicts in the West Asia. Further, another important issue that is happening in West Asia is related to the Iran's nuclear program and the Iran nuclear deal. So in 2018, US had withdrawn from the Iran nuclear deal. However, with the change in presidency now, again, the US wants the Iran nuclear deal to be restarted in order to stop Iran's nuclear program. So the primary goal of United States of America for restart of the Iran nuclear deal is to stop Iran from starting its nuclear program. However, if this nuclear deal is restarted, the sanctions that are currently imposed on the Iran might reduce, and this is a cause of concern for other West Asian countries. This is because these feel that if the sanctions are lifted, it would strengthen Iran economically. That is, Iran would be able to trade its crude oil with other countries normally, and that is going to strengthen its economic position. And once Iran strengthens its economic position, it will also increase its non-nuclear military arsenal, which will pose a threat to the security in the West Asia, because already the Houthi rebels that are active in Yemen against the government of the Yemen are supported by Iran, and these Houthi rebels have conducted various attacks on the oil facilities of Saudi Arabia. So this is a conflicting issue that is going on in the geopolitics of West Asia. Although the things will shape up in the future, and we'll still have to wait for how things shape up. But in the past, in the previous important event that took place in the West Asia was the formalization of Middle Eastern Quad or the West Asian Quad. Now, this West Asian Quad was of primary importance to India because India is also a member of this West Asian Quad. And in one of the past DNS, we have already discussed the various dimensions of the Middle Eastern Quad, how it is going to impact India's interests. So let us revise from that DNS video all these aspects related to the fault lines that exist in the Middle Eastern region, in the West Asia. Also, what are the interests of India as far as the finalization of the Middle Eastern Quad is concerned, or how it is going to impact India's interest in this region.
The formation of this quadrilateral group also marks a shift for India's foreign policy as to how India has been conducting its foreign policy in the West Asian region, and how the formation of this particular regional grouping will transform India's approach towards the West Asia. In this regard, this new term has been formed or has gained currency after the first ever meeting that took place between the foreign ministers of India, Israel, the UAE, and the United States of America. So who all are the members of this squad that is formulating in the West Asia? So these are the members, that is, first is India, second is Israel, third is United Arab Emirates, and fourth is the United States of America. Now this is crucial because, as I have already highlighted, that this marks a shift in India's foreign policy approach towards West Asia. Now in this regard, earlier in the West Asian region, India used to follow a policy that is termed as bilateralism. This is because India used to engage with the countries in the West Asian region based on its interests, and their relation amongst themselves did not impact India's approach towards the West Asian region. We will understand about this aspect in the later part of this discussion. But before this, let us first look at what exactly is the objective of the formulation of this new quad in West Asia, or at least what is the stated objective of the formation of this quad in the West Asian region. So in this regard, the United States of America has said that the main objective of this new quad is expanding economic and political cooperation in the Middle East and Asia, including through trade, combating climate change, energy cooperation, and increasing maritime security. So all these aspects that we see here as the objectives of the Quad in the West Asia look similar to the objectives that were stated by the Quad in Indo-Pacific region. So clearly, the idea that has been highlighted is that it is about economic and political cooperation in the West Asia. It includes improvement in trade infrastructure, combating climate change, energy cooperation, and especially the maritime security. So all these are the objectives. But whenever such objectives are outlined, it does not mean that the foreign policy stops there. Any kind of grouping or agreement that takes place in the international relations has a strategic implication. It also has implications for the members as well as implications for the region as a whole. And that is why, before understanding the formation and the context of this particular grouping, let us first try and understand what exactly is happening in India's neighborhood. Now, in this regard, if we look at India's neighbors on the continental part, we see that a major churning is going on in Afghanistan because of the Taliban's takeover in the Afghanistan. And this takeover of Taliban was facilitated because of early withdrawal of United States of America from Afghanistan. And this has changed the geopolitics of this particular region. And close to Afghanistan lies the West Asian region that we see on our map, and it includes all the countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, United Arab Emirates, UAE, Israel, Iraq, Syria, etc. So this particular region is known as the West Asian region, or is also known as the Middle Eastern region. Now, the geopolitics of West Asia has been very unique. In this regard, there have been three poles in the West Asian region. The first rivalry that existed in the West Asian region included the Sunni-led Saudi Arabia group and the Shia-led Iran countries. And a Cold War kind of situation has been going on in the West Asia between the Saudi Arabia-led countries and the Iran-led countries. So the Saudi Arabia-led countries are Sunni countries, while the Iran-led countries are Shia countries. This is one of the poles in the West Asian region. Second important conflict that is going on in the West Asian region is between Israel and Palestine. Now here, earlier, the Gulf countries including Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., Egypt, all these countries have been supporting the statehood for Palestine. So this is the second pole or second geopolitical issue that exists in the West Asia. That is the conflict between Israel and Palestine and the issue of statehood of Palestine, which is supported by the Arabic countries including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, etc. Here, the role of United States of America has been that it has always been an adversary of Iran in this particular region. And United States of America has been one of the best allies of Israel in this particular region. Now, besides Israel, United States of America has also had extremely good relations with Saudi Arabia. And because of the United States of America's involvement in this particular region, the geopolitics of this particular region gets complicated here. So here the US-Iran rivalry is also one of the aspects of the West Asian geopolitics. Now here, as I've already outlined, US has had good relations with Israel as well as it has had good relations with Saudi Arabia. However, both Israel as well as Saudi Arabia differed on the issue of Palestinian statehood. Because as we all know, the Israel is a Jew-led country while Palestine is an Islamic country. And it also has majority Sunni population. That is why the Sunni countries of the region, especially the Gulf countries as we know them or the Arabic countries, are supporting the statehood of Palestine. And that is why Israel versus the Arab conflict is also one of the features of this particular region. So the first conflict is between Iran and the Saudi Arabia-led countries. Second conflict is between Israel and Palestine. And the third conflict is between Israel and the Arabic countries of this particular region. And here, United States of America has had good relations with Israel as well as with Saudi Arabia. However, the relations between Israel and the Arabic countries were not so good. In this context, last year, during Donald Trump's administration, an accord was signed that was known as the Abraham Accord. And this Abraham Accord marked the normalization of ties between one of the Arabic countries, that is United Arab Emirates, and the Israel. And that is where a change has been witnessed in the geopolitics of West Asia, because this was seen as a significant agreement as far as normalization of ties is concerned between Israel and the Arabic countries, which have been adversaries because of the Israel-Palestine issue, because the Arab countries had supported Palestine earlier, but now because of the signing of the Abraham Accord, there has been normalization of ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And because of the normalization of ties between Israel and the UAE, and also because of the involvement of US in this particular signing of the Abraham Accord, India is now becoming a part of the quadrilateral dialogue that has started in the West Asia, which includes Israel, the UAE, US, and India. So this is the background of the geopolitics in West Asia and how things are shaping up in West Asia, especially after the signing of the Abraham Accord. So as we have just learned that there are three poles or three geopolitical issues that are going on in the West Asian region. First is between the Shia-led Iran and the Sunni-led Saudi rivalry. Second is between Israel and Palestinian. It is known as Israel-Palestine conflict. It is an issue regarding the Jew state and the Islamic Palestinian state or Arabic Palestinian state. Third issue is between Israel and the Arab relations, because these two groupings have fought wars continuously on the issue of Palestine in this particular region. In this line, as we have already learned, that the Abraham Accord marks an important thaw in the relations between Israel and the Arab countries. In this regard, the UAE, Bahrain and Israel have agreed to establish full diplomatic ties as a part of a deal to halt the annexation of the occupied land sought by Palestinians for their future state. And this agreement was mediated by the United States of America, and that is why this new quadrilateral dialogue in the West Asian region has been possible, because of the improvement in relations between Israel and UAE, which was mediated by the United States of America because of Abraham Accords. Now, as we all know that the West Asian region has been extremely important for India because of the crude oil imports, investments and trade relations and the remittances sent by the Indian diaspora. What has been India's strategy towards the West Asian region? So the previous governments in India and their policies have been limited to energy security because of the extreme fault lines that exist in the West Asia, as we have already seen the rivalries between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Israel and Palestine, and also Israel and the Arab countries. And that is why the crucial priority of the governments till now has been to secure the energy interests of India in this particular region. We all know that this region has been a vital area of great power competition and conflicts. It is because of the inherent fault lines that are already existing in this particular region, and also because of the interest and the policies of United States of America in this particular region. So ensuring the stability and security of the Persian Gulf has also been extremely important for India's policy towards the West Asia. This is because majority of the crude oil that India imports comes through the Strait of Hormuz, which lies at a very important strategic choke point in the Persian Gulf. Also in this regard, India has been trying to balance its relations with Israel as well as the Arab world. But because of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and UAE and some other Arabic countries because of the Abraham Accords and the mediation of United States of America, India could expect to tread a more seamless path in West Asia. So this has been a favorable development, and this has also contributed to the creation of this new quadrilateral dialogue in the West Asia. In this regard, till now, India's policy has been marked by continuation of its traditional diplomatic line of non-interference in the internal affairs of the countries. Secondly, in this regard, India has been pursuing its agenda of strategic autonomy in the region with a strong emphasis on bilateralism. Strategic autonomy here simply means that India has been pursuing its relations based on its interests rather than getting involved into the conflicts that are existing in this particular region. And this approach and the natural consequence of the following of strategic autonomy is the policy of bilateralism. That is, India has been focusing on improving the bilateral relations between India and the other countries of this particular region. Already India has had good relations with Palestine, the other Arabic countries as well as Iran in this particular region. And by pursuing the theory of strategic autonomy and the bilateralism or the policy of bilateralism, India has marked upon deepening India's security ties with its Gulf Arab partners. So India has been clearly walking a tightrope in the intra-Arab disputes and has been carefully weighing its interests by the perusal of strategic autonomy policy in the West Asian region. So in this context, what are the implications of the formation of this new quadrilateral forum in the West Asian region? Now, although the contours of this new quadrilateral forum are still to be finalized or yet to be finalized and take a proper shape, let us look at some of the implications in this regard. So the first and the foremost implication of this new quad is that this emerging multilateral pact may fill the gap that the United States of America is leaving in the Middle East and has the potential to transform the region's geopolitics and geoeconomics, because earlier there used to be a rivalry between Israel and the Arab countries, and this rivalry is simply thawing because of the Abraham Accords mediated by the United States of America. And in general, it is assumed and known that US has been slowly withdrawing from this particular region in order to focus more on China, because the US's presence in this particular region has been very economically costly to the United States of America. Secondly, this new group can deepen its engagement on various aspects like trade, energy ties, fighting climate change, and enhancing maritime security. Further, this group is likely to boost the already existing relationship of India in this particular region. And we all know that India and Israel have been inculcating or improving their relations in the recent past. Israel is the second largest arms supplier to India. It provides cybersecurity solutions to secure its critical infrastructure. Israel also trains India's special forces on counterterrorism. And in Kashmir, Israel trains Indian police officers and equips the security forces with surveillance technology and foliage penetrating radar. And that is why the formation of this squad can further boost or give a boost to India-Israel relations. And besides this, the India-Israel relations coincide with a stronger relationship between India and the Gulf countries. We all know that India-UAE relations have been thriving in the recent past because of the trade and the Indian community that lives here, and also because of the remittances sent by these particular community to India. In this regard, India and the United Arab Emirates have already started to align more on geopolitical affairs beyond the conventional three pillars of their relationship, that is, oil, remittances, and diaspora. And that is, India and UAE have also been collaborating on the security architecture in this particular region. They've also been collaborating on the issues like terrorism, which are common concerns. And that is why already India-Israel relations are improving, and India-UAE relations have also been on stronger footing. And that's why the creation of this new quad can give a boost to the India-UAE relations as well as India-Israel relations, and collectively these three countries can come together to shape the important geostrategic relationship in this particular region. Now, although these look like some of the positive implications for India, but there are some concerns from this particular partnership. So one of the critical challenges is that where does Saudi Arabia stand in this particular calculation and the formation of this new partnership or the forum, whatever you call it? Because we all know that Saudi Arabia is one of the significant player in the West Asian region, and it is the biggest Arab economy in this particular region. So what would be the position of Saudi Arabia with regards to this quadrilateral group that has been formed? That needs to be more clear in the near future, and that is also a cause of concern as far as the future of this quadrilateral forum or this partnership is concerned. Now, although Saudi has nurtured good relations with Israel as well as India, and it may look to this grouping as a strategic opportunity in the long run, but it still needs to be seen as to how the relationship between Saudi and this new forum unfolds in the near future. Another area of concern for India is that except India, the other three countries, that is Israel, the UAE and the United States of America, are the adversaries of Iran. And it can be a cause of concern for India-Iran relations. We all know that Iran is also a significant country for India in the West Asian region because India and Iran have been collaborating on some of the strategic projects like the Chabahar port project in the Iran, through which India seeks to counter the Chinese influence in the Gwadar port in Pakistan. And also, the Chabahar port is crucial for India's Connect Central Asia policies. So that is why if India gets or becomes a member of any strategic alliance which includes Israel, UAE and United States of America, it can have adverse impact on India-Iran relations. Also, because of the historical good relations between India and Iran, India can also use this relationship for improvement in the situation that is unfolding in Afghanistan. That is why if India-Iran relations deteriorate, it is likely to have negative implications for India in the near future. Further, as we have already learned that the formation of this particular forum can provide a geostrategic solution to the issue of withdrawal of US from the region. However, the US policy towards India has not been very clear or concrete in this regard. So in this regard, if you look at the US's policy towards India, US has been collaborating with India in the Indo-Pacific in the form of quadrilateral security dialogue. Also, US and India have signed all the foundational defense agreements. But at the same time, despite the presence of quadrilateral security dialogue and the defense agreements between the two countries, US has created a parallel security partnership in the form of AUKUS, that is Australia, UK and US partnership in the Indo-Pacific region. And this is considered as the most crucial security partnership in the Indo-Pacific region, of which India is not a part. So this clearly highlights that the United States of America's policy has not been very clear towards India or has not been very concrete towards India. Further, we note that the United States of America withdrew from Afghanistan without even taking India into confidence, because when the negotiation was going on with the Taliban, the US collaborated with Russia, China and Pakistan in the form of Troika Plus, and it did not invite India. So this clearly shows that the US has not been involving India at all the forums, and that is why the strategic alliance between India and US is not that concrete in the present times. So even when the India, US, Israel and UAE will be collaborating in this new quadrilateral forum, it is unclear as to what exactly or where does India stand in the United States of America's larger policy in the West Asian region. So these are some of the concerns regarding the partnership that is unfolding in the West Asia. Now, till now, India has been pursuing a policy of strategic autonomy and bilateralism as far as the West Asian region is concerned. But by becoming a member of this new quadrilateral forum, this foreign policy stance of India might change because India will now be a part of the larger security architecture that is shaping up in the West Asian region because of the formation of the new quadrilateral forum involving Israel, UAE, US, and India. So, in this regard, questions have been asked in the previous years regarding the consequences of any important event on India's interests. So, similarly, you can expect a question in the upcoming mains examination. In this regard, you should write or practice this particular question and try to answer this question by using the points that we have discussed during this particular discussion on the new quadrilateral group and its implications and its impact on India's interests. With this, let's take up the next news article now.
This editorial on page number 8 is related to a new bill that has been introduced in the parliament that is known as Criminal Procedure Identification Bill 2022. Now, this new Criminal Procedure Identification Bill 2022 seeks to amend the Identification of Prisoners Act 1920. And this particular act authorizes taking the measurements of the convicts and other persons for the purpose of identification and investigation in criminal matters. However, the new changes that are being brought about through this Criminal Procedure Identification Bill 2022 has raised certain concerns of privacy and data safety, and that is why this editorial raises the concern that the bill further requires scrutiny so that it can be brought in line with the concerns of privacy and safety concerns. In this regard, let us look at the key aspects of the bill and why was it required, and also what are some of the issues that have been raised against this bill. Now, this Criminal Procedure Identification Bill of 2022 seeks to include finger impressions, palm print impressions, foot impressions, photographs, iris, retina scan, physical, biological samples, etc., and capturing all these samples by the use of modern technologies because the technology has evolved ever since the Identification of Prisoners Act 1922 was formulated. And that is why it seeks to incorporate new kinds of identification that can be brought about by the use of modern technology. Now, looking at the reasons to introduce this Criminal Procedure Amendment Bill 2022, we will first have to understand what were the key aspects of the Identification of Prisoners Act 1920. In this line, this 1920 Act was enacted to authorize taking of measurements and photographs of convicts and other persons. In this line, the term measurements that was used in the 1920 Act was limited in nature because it allowed only taking the finger impressions and foot impressions of limited category of convicted as well as non-convicted persons and photographs on the order of a magistrate. Further, the 1920 Act limited the category of prisoners whose record could be taken. And that is why it was considered necessary to expand the ambit of the persons whose measurements can be taken. Now, if this ambit is increased, such measurements or increase in the number of identification markers would help the investigating agencies to gather sufficiently legal admissible evidence and establish the crime of the accused person. And that is why this new 2022 bill, that is the Criminal Procedure Identification Bill, has been introduced. Now, what this new bill seeks to do, or how is it an improvement over the bill that was enacted back in 1920 during the British era? Now, this Criminal Procedure Identification Bill of 2022 seeks to use modern technology for identification. And modern technology allows to capture and record appropriate body measurements with the help of forensic experts. And that is why the bill provides for legal sanctions for taking appropriate body measurements of persons who are required to give such measurements. Also, it seeks to improve the efficiency of investigation and will also help in increasing the conviction. In this line, let us look at what are the important aspects of this bill. So, first thing that this bill seeks to do is expand the scope of measurements. In this line, by expanding the scope of measurements, it will include fingerprint impressions, palm print, footprint impressions, photographs, iris and retina scan, physical biological samples and their analysis. Second thing that the bill seeks to do is empower the National Crime Records Bureau. In this line, the NCRB will be able to collect, store and preserve the record of the measurements for sharing, dissemination, destruction and disposal of the records. Third thing that the bill seeks to do is empower the magistrates to direct persons accused of criminal activities to give these measurements like the retina scan or the fingerprint or the palm print and the footprint impressions. And lastly, it seeks to empower the police or the prison officer to take the measurements of any person who resists or refuses to give the measurements. That is why it takes into account all the stakeholders that are required to capture these identification from the criminals. So in summary, we can understand that the scope of identification that could be collected under the Identification of Prisoners Act 1920 was limited. And in the line with the changing modern technology, new kinds of identifications have been developed, and that is why this bill seeks to incorporate these new kinds of identification markers for the criminals. And that is why it has expanded the scope of these measurements. It has empowered the National Crime Records Bureau and has empowered the magistrates as well as the police or the prison officer. Now, despite the new changes that this bill seeks to bring, there are certain concerns that have been raised. First concern is about the privacy concern. That is, gathering of the personal details are subject to misuse and it also infringes the privacy law. And that is why the editorial raises the concern that the new bill should take into account all the aspects of privacy of the accused people. Because not everybody who is accused is going to be convicted for the crime, and that is why the privacy of the detail of such persons has to be taken into account while formulating any bill related to identification, because the modern technology increases the number of identification markers and which can be an intrusion into the privacy of the persons. Second concern that has been raised is against self-incrimination. In this line, if you look at the Article 20 of the Indian Constitution, it provides for protection in respect of conviction for the offences. And the third part of this Article 20 says that no person accused of any offence shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. That is, nobody can be compelled to become a witness against himself or herself. However, the bill enables coercive drawing of samples including the DNA and the narco test. And this kind of provision can violate the Article 23, which protects the rights of an accused against self-incrimination. Third important concern is related to the manner of data collection. And in this regard, the concerns have been raised on the manner of data collection, as resistance by the person is a punishable offense under the IPC. That is, the person cannot deny the collection of the identification markers. Further, although the new bill provides the provision of destruction of the records and it empowers the National Crime Records Bureau to do so, however, it is being said that the process that will be deployed to destroy these records will be easier said than done. That is, on the paper, although it looks like that the records will be destroyed in the long run, however, it will not be that easy and it will be a cumbersome process. Now, such kind of identification markers that will be collected by the use of the new provisions under the bill, it is being said that such kind of provisions can be used against protesters and the activists. And there has been seen that there is a tendency to arrest activists and protesters and even innocent people and invoking grave charges on them. That is why in such an environment, if such rigid laws are brought in which seeks to intrude the privacy and are aimed at targeting certain sections, can become controversial in the near future. Further, it bars the court proceedings from the things done in good faith. And further, it is being said that such kind of a law is against right to be forgotten, because the measurements that are collected under this act will be retained for almost 75 years from the date of collection. And such retention of the data of the individuals for 75 years is in violation of the right to be forgotten, which is seen as essential part of right to privacy under the Article 21, which was highlighted in the K.S. Puttaswamy judgment. That is why the concerns related to this bill are against privacy concerns, against self-incrimination, that is, compelling a person to be a witness against himself or herself. The issues have also been raised against the manner of data collection, which is coercive in nature, and also the process of destroying records might become cumbersome in the long run. Further, the provisions of the law can be used to target certain protesters and activists, and at the same time, it is seen as against right to be forgotten. And that is why the editorial has raised the concern that because of the violation of certain fundamental rights like right to privacy and the Article 23, it would be appropriate to refer the bill to a standing committee for a deeper scrutiny before this law is enacted. So these are few concerns related to the Criminal Procedure Identification Bill of 2022. With this, let's take up the next news article now. This article on page number 9 is related to the economic crisis that is happening in Sri Lanka. Now, the economic crisis that is unfolding in Sri Lanka is a result of interplay of some of the international factors as well as some of the domestic policies. Now, although it is not a very important topic for us from the exam perspective, let's say the mains exam or the prelims exam perspective, however, for aspirants who are appearing for the interview, this can be a very important topic to understand because it is one of the important neighborhood countries of India, which India focuses on in its foreign policy, especially in the wake of countering the Chinese presence in the Sri Lanka. And that is why this economic crisis that is happening in Sri Lanka should be understood. So in this article, we'll just restrict ourselves to what exactly is happening in Sri Lanka or what kind of economic crisis is Sri Lanka facing, and also what are the factors that have contributed to this economic crisis. Let us look at all these things in detail now. Now, if you look at the present status of Sri Lankan economy, there are various issues that are being faced by Sri Lanka right now. First in this line is the shortage of foreign exchange reserve, which is important for payment of imports like crude oil, etc. Second issue is related to high inflation rate. Also, there is issue of shortage of essential items which include food, fuel, medicine, cement, etc. At the same time, the country is also facing the issue of higher debt and there is possibility of default on loan payments, and all these factors together are contributing to a kind of crisis in the Sri Lankan economy. Now, if you look at the shortage of foreign exchange reserve, the Sri Lankan foreign exchange reserves have declined to just $2.3 billion, which is sufficient to pay for just 1 month's imports. And you might be knowing that Sri Lanka does not have its own oil deposits, and that is why it is hugely dependent upon oil imports. Now, this situation is similar to India. However, India has considerable foreign exchange reserves. That is what makes India secure to the crude oil imports. For the second issue that is faced by Sri Lanka is the higher inflation rate. Now, in this line, the reduced foreign exchange reserves are also contributing to this higher inflation because many of the things are imported in Sri Lanka, for example, the crude oil, also food related articles, etc. In this line, due to the fall in the foreign exchange reserves, it has reduced the ability of Sri Lanka to pay for essential imports such as food, fuel, and medicines. And because of all these issues, the rate of inflation in Sri Lanka presently is almost 18%. And you might be knowing that in case of India, the Monetary Policy Committee has set a target of inflation rate of 4 plus minus 2%. Third issue that the Sri Lankan economy is facing is the shortage of essential items. And due to the foreign exchange reserve crisis, the country is facing severe fuel shortages, which is leading to daily power cuts. Also, the country is facing issues of acute shortage of food, medicines, and it is leading to long queues in front of grocery stores, pharmacies, as well as fuel depots. Further, the debt situation of Sri Lanka is also very problematic, and the public debt to GDP ratio stands at about 119%, which shows that Sri Lanka has borrowed beyond its repaying capacity. Further, most of its loans are in the form of external loans from Asian Development Bank, Japan, China, and India. And also there is possibility of default on loan repayments. That is, Sri Lanka has just $2.3 billion in its reserves, but it is required to repay external loans worth $4 billion this year, which is below the paying capacity of the Sri Lankan government presently. And all these factors together are contributing to an economic crisis in Sri Lanka. In this line, what has led to this economic crisis or which factors contributed to this current economic crisis? Let us look at these factors. Some of these factors are external and some other factors are internal to the policies that were adopted by the Sri Lankan government. The first cause of economic crisis in Sri Lanka is the flawed external sector structure of Sri Lankan economy. In this line, Sri Lanka is hugely dependent on imports, and imports into Sri Lanka are much higher than its exports, which leads to huge outflow of foreign exchange. Further, as far as its imports are concerned, Sri Lanka pays its imports through the revenue that it earns through tourism as well as remittances. However, the Sri Lankan economy has been facing the issue of decline in tourism sector, which is one of the important revenue sources for the Sri Lankan government, and this tourism sector has been adversely impacted in the recent times, first because of the Easter bombing attacks that happened in 2017, and also because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The tourism sector has been adversely impacted. Now, tourism is one of the important sectors of the Sri Lankan economy because it accounts for almost 10% of the Sri Lankan GDP and is also a major contributor to the forex reserve. So, in the wake of decline in the tourism sector, the contribution of tourism sector in the Sri Lankan GDP has reduced considerably, and accordingly, the foreign exchange reserves have also fallen down. Besides this, if you look at the export sector, Sri Lankan exports include tea, rubber, spices, garment, etc. However, all these have been impacted because of disruption of the supply chains due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Other than this, there has been impact of Russia-Ukraine war also on the Sri Lankan economy. In this line, when tourism is one of the important sectors that contributes to the Sri Lankan GDP, the tourists from Russia and Ukraine accounted for almost 25% of the tourists in Sri Lanka. And this number has dropped considerably because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Further, we all are aware that the Russia-Ukraine war has led to increase in the global crude oil prices. And Sri Lanka, which is importing the crude oil and has very limited foreign exchange reserves, is not able to pay for the crude oil imports. Besides this, the Sri Lankan tea, which is one of the important exports of Sri Lanka, the destination of this export was to Russia and Ukraine, and these were the major importers. And because of the Russia Ukraine war and the sanctions that have been imposed, it is becoming difficult for Sri Lanka to export tea, etc., to Russia and Ukraine. And further, Sri Lanka imports about 45% of its wheat and more than half of its soybean and sunflower oil, peas, and asbestos from Russia and Ukraine. And because of this, there is crisis of food sector also in Sri Lanka. Further, we are aware that China has invested heavily in Sri Lanka, and Chinese loans are considered to be a kind of debt trap diplomacy, which has led to higher debt obligations for Sri Lanka to China. So, this is also one of the contributing factors to the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Besides these, there have been certain other factors like the International Monetary Fund's conditionalities that it provides when it provides loans to the governments. So in 2016, Sri Lanka had borrowed about $1.5 billion loans from the International Monetary Fund. However, IMF had imposed a condition on Sri Lanka that its fiscal deficit must be reduced to 3.5% by 2020. And because of these conditionalities of limiting the fiscal deficit to 3.5% by 2020, severely constrained or reduced the government's ability to adopt counter-cyclical fiscal policy to stimulate economic growth. You might be aware that when the Indian economy was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, the government of India was able to invest more in the economy by breaching the fiscal deficit targets for a few years. But that was not possible for the Sri Lankan government because it had taken loans from the IMF, and under the conditionalities, it had to reduce its fiscal deficit to about 3.5% by 2020. Further, the fiscal policy that was followed by the Sri Lankan government was also flawed. And in 2019, when the new government had taken over in Sri Lanka, it reduced the tax rates considerably and had announced higher subsidies on account of vote bank politics. So, when the tax rates are reduced, the revenue of the government also reduced. And when higher subsidies were provided on account of vote bank politics, the expenditure of the government increased, further increasing the fiscal deficit of the government and reducing its capability to invest in sectors which can boost the economic growth like the infrastructure, etc. And last but not the least, one of the important factors that is contributing to food shortages in Sri Lanka is the adoption of organic farming. In this line, Sri Lanka annually spends about $260 million, that is about 0.3% of its GDP, on fertilizer subsidies. And most of these fertilizers are imported. So the government, in order to reduce its import of fertilizers and to prevent the drain of foreign exchange reserve, the government banned the import of all fertilizers. Further, the government declared that Sri Lanka would overnight become a 100% organic farming nation. And this pushed Sri Lanka to the brink of a disaster because it considerably reduced the food production because of adoption of organic farming as a policy by the government. And 100% organic farming policy which was adopted by the government, plus the reduction in the imports of the fertilizers, has reduced the production considerably. So all these factors have cumulatively contributed to the economic crisis that Sri Lanka is facing right now. With this, we conclude today's discussion, and this is the question for the day.